Copper coats the back of your throat when the radio finally dies. That's what Quinn tasted. 14 heat signatures bleeding through the thermal scope, moving up the shale ridge. No backup. Just her, 3 magazines, and a fractured rib. They thought they had cornered a stray. They didn't know she was Recon. Gritting her teeth, Quinn pressed her cheek against the synthetic stock of the Mark 13 sniper rifle. The composite material was baking hot, radiating the midday sun directly into her cheekbone. She didn't flinch. Flinching meant movement, and movement meant death. Down below, the valley floor was a scarred mosaic of sun-baked clay and crumbling limestone. The air smelled of pulverized rock and old copper, the lingering scent of an artillery strike from 3 days ago that had left the town a graveyard. Her hide site was a blown-out third-floor apartment that hadn't seen civilian life in a decade. A filthy, piss-stained mattress baffled the sound of her potential shots, and a layer of fine, talcum-like dust coated every millimeter of her gear. It ground into the hinges of her jaw. It settled in the creases of her cracked lips. Her spotter, Miller, was gone. Not dead, but medevaced out 30 hours ago with a piece of shrapnel the size of a spark plug lodged in his thigh. Command had promised a relief element by 0600. It was now 1,400. The radio had spit nothing but white noise and aggressive static for the last 4 hours. She was entirely alone. Quinn shifted her weight, a millimeter at a time, trying to relieve the throbbing ache in her left knee. Navy SEALs weren't supposed to have bad knees, but 10 years of carrying 90-pound rucksacks out of helicopters in the dark had a way of altering human anatomy. She wasn't a superhero. She was 32, chronically sleep-deprived, and currently functioning on a handful of dry coffee grounds she had chewed and swallowed hours ago. Her heart thumped a sluggish, heavy rhythm against her bruised ribs. Through the spotting scope, the magnification cut through the heat mirage. 14 men. They weren't local militia. They moved with a predatory, spaced-out discipline. Weapons at the low ready. Staggered columns. They were sweeping the ruins, methodically clearing the buildings along the main supply route. And they were heading straight for the abandoned medical cache in the basement of the clinic, the very cache Quinn had been left behind to overwatch. Her stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. The clinic was a trap. Inside that basement were 3 wounded Allied pilots whose transport had been shot down a mile away. They couldn't move. Command was supposed to get them out, but the airspace was hot. If those 14 men crossed the threshold of the clinic, the pilots would be butchered. Quinn dragged her eye away from the optic and stared at the peeling yellow wallpaper of her hideout. She could pack up. She could slip down the fire escape, vanish into the wadi, and hike 12 miles to the extraction point. It was what the manual suggested when severely outnumbered and outgunned without comms. Survival dictated evasion. But the memory of the pilots, one of them barely 20, coughing up pink froth anchored her to the floorboards. She pulled the bolt back. The metallic snick was deafening in the silence of the room. A single, 300 Winchester Magnum round slid into the chamber. She pushed the bolt forward and locked it down. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "Okay." She reached for the encrypted local radio. It was a short-range brick, useless for reaching command, but it could hit the unsecured frequencies the hunting party below was likely using to coordinate. She punched in the standard civilian distress channel, the one she knew they monitored to hunt stragglers. She pressed the push-to-talk button. The plastic dug into her thumb. Unidentified element approaching the South Clinic. Her voice was dead flat. Not angry, not commanding, just hollow. "This is your last warning. Turn back. I am Recon trained, and you are walking into a kill box." She released the button. Silence filled the earpiece. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a voice crackled back through the speaker. The man spoke heavily accented English, his tone thick with amusement. "We see your glint, little bird. You are 1 rifle. We are 14. We will come up and take it from you." Quinn closed her eyes. She hadn't made a mistake with a glint. She was set deep in the shadows, veiled by netting. He was lying, trying to provoke a reaction. But he had confirmed. They knew someone was here, and they didn't care. She didn't feel a surge of righteous fury. She just felt exhausted. A deep, bone-weary sadness washed over her. It wasn't about the morality of killing. It was the sheer, ugly labor of it. 14 lives. 14 triggers to pull. 14 mothers who would get phone calls. It was a messy, horrible mathematics, and she was the only calculator left. She settled her eye back behind the scope. The crosshairs floated over the lead man. He was large, wearing a faded tactical vest over a dark shirt. He was pointing toward her building, directing 2 men to flank the clinic. Quinn exhaled. She let the breath drain out of her lungs until she reached the natural respiratory pause. The world stopped spinning. The dust stopped moting. Her heartbeat became a distant, muffled drum. Crack. The rifle bucked violently, driving the buttstock into the bruised meat of her shoulder. The concussive wave of the suppressed shot kicked up a cloud of dust from the mattress, coating her eyelashes in grit. Down in the valley, the lead man didn't fly backward like in the movies. He simply folded. His knees gave out instantly, and he dropped like a sack of wet cement, a sudden dark stain blooming on the back of his neck. For a fraction of a second, the remaining 13 men froze, their brains failing to process the sudden transition from predator to prey. Quinn didn't freeze. Her hand was a blur of practiced muscle memory. Bolt up, pull back, push forward, lock down. The empty brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and landing on the floorboards with a sharp times tink times that sounded like a dropped coin. It rolled against her bare forearm, searing the skin. She hissed, ignoring the burn. Crack. The second shot caught the radio operator squarely in the chest. He spun wildly, his rifle discharging a burst of automatic fire into the dirt before he collapsed backward over a pile of cinder blocks. Now, the panic set in. Shouts echoed up the valley walls. The enemy scattered, diving behind rusted-out cars, concrete barricades, and collapsed walls. The dusty street was suddenly empty, save for the 2 bodies bleeding out in the sun. Quinn didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. Her eye burned from staring through the optic, a sharp needle of pain drilling into her temple. She blinked hard, forcing a tear to clear her vision. They were professionals, but they were shocked. They had expected a frightened infantryman taking wild potshots, not a surgically placed bullet from 600 yards. 2, she muttered to herself, the taste of copper growing stronger in her mouth. A shadow shifted behind the chassis of a burned-out pickup truck. It was subtle, just a slight change in the geometry of the dark space. Quinn adjusted her elevation dial 2 clicks. She didn't aim for the edge of the truck. She aimed straight through the rusted sheet metal of the door. Crack. The shadow violently jerked, and a man stumbled out from behind the truck, clutching his abdomen, screaming a wet, ragged sound that carried all the way up to her window. He collapsed in the dirt, writhing. Quinn felt a cold knot tighten in her gut. A clean kill was one thing. A gut shot was a horror show. She watched him thrash, knowing the kinetic energy of the heavy round had shattered his pelvis. She hated this. She hated the sound of his screaming. It made her human, and right now, being human was a liability. She racked the bolt again. Another hot casing hit the floor. Crack. The screaming stopped. The man lay still. 4, she whispered. Her voice shook, just a fraction. She swallowed hard, forcing the nausea down. Gunfire erupted from below. They had located her general direction. Bullets began chewing into the brickwork of the apartment building, chunks of masonry exploding outward in clouds of red dust. A heavy machine gun joined the chorus, its rhythmic times, thump, thump, thump times, tearing through the facade of the floor below her. Quinn pressed herself flat against the floorboards, the vibrations of the impacts rattling her teeth. The air filled with the sharp chemical stench of cordite and the dusty smell of pulverized concrete. A stray round punched through the ceiling above her, showering her back with plaster. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. She let them burn through their ammunition. She let them feel the illusion of control. When the machine gun paused to reload, she pushed herself back up to the rifle. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Her eye found the optic. The gunner was crouched behind a low wall, wrestling a new belt of ammunition into the feed tray. His head was exposed for exactly 2 seconds. Crack. The gunner slumped forward over his weapon, the ammunition belt slipping from his lifeless fingers and clattering to the ground. 5. The return fire became erratic, desperate. They were realizing the geometry of the fight. She had the high ground, the distance, and the patience. They had nothing but the dwindling cover of the ruins. Quinn shifted her aim to a narrow alleyway. 3 men were trying to flank, moving in a tight stack, thinking the buildings would shield them. They didn't realize the alley funneled perfectly into her line of sight. She took a breath, held it. Crack. The rear man dropped. Crack. The middle man scrambled, slipping in the blood of his comrade before taking a round through the shoulder that spun him into the brick wall. He slid down, leaving a thick, dark smear against the masonry. The lead man panicked. Instead of pushing forward, he turned and ran back the way he came, breaking the cardinal rule of a kill zone: never backtrack into an open line of sight. Quinn tracked his sprint. Her reticle led him by a foot. Crack. He tripped forward, as if his shoelaces had been tied together, plowing face first into the dirt and skidding to a halt. 8. Her rifle was smoking. The barrel was radiating so much heat that the mirage was distorting the scope's picture. She pulled the rifle back into the room, ejecting the empty magazine. She fumbled with the pouch on her chest rig, her fingers clumsy and numb. She dropped the fresh magazine.
"Damn it!"
she hissed, slapping her hand against the floorboards in frustration. She scrambled for the magazine, her fractured rib biting into her lung like a hot knife. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, and squeezed her eyes shut until the stars faded from her vision. She slammed the fresh magazine home, racked the bolt, and pushed the rifle back onto the mattress. There were 6 left. The silence returned to the valley, heavier this time. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of terror. The remaining men were pinned, separated, and acutely aware that moving meant dying. Quinn wiped a mixture of sweat and dust from her forehead with the back of her grimy glove. She looked down at the radio sitting near her knee. The green light blinked steadily. She picked it up, her thumb hovering over the button. She could hear her own harsh breathing in the quiet room. "I told you," she broadcasted, her voice low, raspy, stripped of any bravado. "I told you to turn back." She released the button and waited. She wanted them to run. God, she wanted them to just run away so she could stop doing this. Her shoulder was black and blue, her eye was throbbing, and she felt completely hollowed out. The radio cracked. It was the same voice, but the amusement was gone, replaced by a tight, strained edge. "You are a dead woman," he spat. "We are calling mortar support. You will burn in that room." Quinn stared blankly at the radio. Mortars. If they had mortars, this entire building would be reduced to rubble in less than 5 minutes. She didn't reply. She dropped the radio and slid back behind the scope. The calculus had just changed. She didn't have time to wait them out anymore. She had to hunt the last 6 before they could radio for coordinates. She exhaled, the taste of pennies flooding her mouth once more. "Okay," she whispered to the empty room. "Let's finish it." The mortar threat hung in the stifling air, heavier than the dust. Mortars meant indirect fire. It meant the high ground didn't matter. They would just drop high explosive shells through the roof until she was ground into the floorboards alongside the rat droppings and the plaster. Quinn's hands began to shake. It wasn't fear, not the conscious kind. It was the biological dump of adrenaline violently clashing with severe physical exhaustion. Her muscles were vibrating, starved of glycogen, demanding she run. "Stop it," she told herself, pressing her forehead against the back of her grimy hand. "Breathe." She needed the radio man, the guy with the heavy accent who had just spoken to her. He would have the long-range comms required to call in a fire mission. The local walkie-talkies the others carried didn't have the wattage to punch through the valley's interference to a mortar pit. She pressed her bruised eye back to the optic. The glare from the afternoon sun was shifting, stretching the shadows across the ruins. She scanned the hard cover, a collapsed cinder block wall, a rusted-out hollow shell of a city bus, the alleyway where the 3 bodies lay. There, behind the shattered concrete husk of what used to be a bakery, the thick black whip antenna of a military manpack radio poked over the top of a low wall. It bobbed slightly, left to right. The man wearing it was pacing. He was completely shielded. 2 feet of reinforced concrete stood between her bullet and his chest. A 300 Win Mag could punch through a lot of things, but it couldn't reliably defeat a structural bakery wall at 600 yards without deflecting. She needed him to step out. "Hey," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp in her own ears. She adjusted her crosshairs, aiming not at the antenna but at the jagged edge of the concrete wall, roughly at head height. She didn't have a clear shot at him, but she had a clear shot at the physics around him. She exhaled. Crack. The heavy bullet slammed into the corner of the wall. The kinetic transfer was violent. A massive chunk of concrete exploded inward, sending a spray of sharp, high-velocity spalling directly into the space behind the wall. A sharp cry echoed up the valley. The antenna violently jerked. The man stumbled backward out of the cover, his hands flying to his face where the stone shrapnel had shredded his cheek. He was blind with pain, exposed in the open dirt for 2 agonizingly long seconds. Quinn ran the bolt. The brass flew, the new round seated. Crack. The radio man dropped instantly, the heavy radio dragging him backward into the dust. The black antenna whipped wildly, then settled flat against the ground. 9. She didn't have time to process it. The sound of the spalling had acted like a starter pistol for the others. Realizing their mortar call was dead in the dirt, the remaining 5 men panicked. They broke cover simultaneously, abandoning any semblance of tactical spacing. It was a desperate, chaotic rush toward the only cover large enough to hide all of them, the clinic. They were 50 yards from the clinic doors. Quinn's pulse hammered in her neck. The crosshairs swept right. She caught a runner moving fast in a zigzag pattern. He was too fast, too erratic. She let him, pulled the trigger. Crack. The round kicked up a geyser of dirt, a foot behind his heel. A miss. The sound of the miss rattled her. She swore, racking the bolt with too much force. The metallic scrape was loud, jarring. She pushed the bolt forward, but it didn't lock. It stopped dead halfway. No. No, no, no. She looked down. The fine talcum powder dust of the apartment, combined with the heavy carbon buildup of rapid firing, had turned the oil in the receiver into a thick, gritty paste. A casing was caught, wedged awkwardly against the chamber. Down below, the men were closing the distance, 40 yards. Quinn slammed the heel of her hand against the bolt handle. Pain flared up her arm, a sickening jolt that traveled straight into her fractured rib. She gasped, a wet, ugly sound, and hit it again. Harder. Skin tore off her knuckles against the sharp steel. The bolt locked. She threw herself behind the scope, 30 yards. She found the center mass of the nearest runner. Crack. He pitched forward, sliding on his chest across the gravel, his rifle skittering away from him. 10. The bolt action was stiff, grinding like sandpaper. She muscled it back, ejected the brass, shoved it forward. Another man was diving for the rusted chassis of a burned-out sedan near the clinic steps. He slid behind the rear tire. She had only his lower leg. It wasn't a kill shot, it didn't matter. Crack. The round shattered the man's femur just above the knee. He screamed, rolling out from behind the tire in pure agony, clutching the bloody ruin of his leg. He was exposed. Quinn racked the stiff bolt again. Her breathing was ragged, sucking in the dust-choked air. Crack. The screaming stopped. 11. 3 left. They had reached the blind spot. The overhang of the clinic roof swallowed the remaining 3 men. She couldn't see them, but they were right outside the heavy steel doors leading to the basement, where the pilots were. Damn it, she choked out, her vision swimming. She reached for the water tube on her shoulder, biting the plastic valve. Nothing. Dry air hissed into her parched throat. She had to change angles. The mattress was useless now. Quinn rolled onto her side. The fractured rib shifted, grinding against the cartilage. White-hot pain spiked behind her eyes. She bit through her lower lip to keep from crying out, the sharp, metallic taste of fresh blood flooding her mouth. Dragging the heavy rifle by the sling, she crawled across the floorboards, leaving a smear of sweat and dust in her wake. She moved toward a fist-sized hole in the brickwork on the far side of the room, blasted out by a stray round earlier. It would give her a steep, plunging angle on the clinic doors. She pushed the barrel through the jagged brick, mindful not to let it protrude. She pressed her bleeding face against the rough plaster. 3 men, piled against the steel door. One was frantically working a crowbar into the seam, trying to pry it open. The metal groaned, a high, screeching sound that carried on the wind. They were going to get in. The geometry was terrible. She was looking almost straight down, a sharp angle that made estimating bullet drop and windage a nightmare. Her reticle floated over the top of the head of the man with the crowbar. She couldn't pause to do the math. The steel door gave a loud times pop times as the latch began to buckle. Quinn aimed 2 inches below the crown of his head to account for the steep downward trajectory. She squeezed. Crack. The top of the man's skull vanished in a pink mist. He collapsed against the steel door, his dead weight pushing it back shut with a dull clang. 12. The man standing next to him flinched, splattered with the blood of his comrade. He looked up. It was the fatal mistake. He locked eyes with the dark hole in the brickwork of the 3rd floor. He raised his rifle, stepping backward into the open courtyard to get an angle. Quinn fought the bolt. It was binding hard now. She struck it with a closed fist. The chamber closed. The man below fired first. A burst of 7.62 millimeters rounds chewed into the exterior of Quinn's building. A bullet struck the brick just inches below her loophole. The impact exploded the masonry. A shard of red-hot brick the size of a razor blade sliced across Quinn's cheekbone, narrowly missing her eye. She didn't blink. She couldn't afford to. The world narrowed to the crosshairs. Crack. The man's chest caved inward. He dropped his rifle, stared at his chest in mild surprise, and sat down hard in the dust before slumping sideways. 13. One left. The leader. The man who had spoken on the radio. The man who had threatened her with fire. He was nowhere to be seen. Quinn pulled her face away from the wall. Blood poured from the deep gash on her cheek, running hot and fast down her jawline, dripping onto the collar of her uniform. She wiped it away with a trembling hand, smearing crimson across her dust-caked face. The silence returned. It was absolute. No wind, no gunfire, just the heavy rhythmic thud of her own dying heart in her ears. Where was he? She kept her eye against the scope, scanning the tight perimeter of the clinic. The bodies of his men lay strewn like discarded rags. Nothing moved. 10 minutes passed. The sun dipped behind the western ridge, instantly dropping the temperature in the valley. The shadows lengthened, turning the ruins into a jagged landscape of black ink. Quinn's body began to betray her. The adrenaline crash hit like a physical blow. Her limbs felt like they were filled with cold lead. Nausea washed over her in sickening waves. She was dangerously dehydrated, bleeding, and running entirely on empty. If she passed out now, the last man would walk into that clinic and finish the job. "Come on," she whispered, a desperate plea to no one. "Just show yourself." A metallic clink. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, the sound of a metal buckle scraping against concrete. It came from the second floor of the clinic itself. He had slipped inside a side window while she was moving her position. He wasn't going for the basement anymore. He was hunting the hunter. Quinn swept the optic up to the dark, blown-out windows of the clinic's upper level. The distance was exactly 400 yards. She saw the slow, deliberate crawl of a rifle barrel creeping over the windowsill. He was looking for her. He had the advantage of deep shadow inside the room. She was backlit by the failing light pushing through the rear of her apartment. If she moved, he would see the silhouette. She froze, her finger hovering over the trigger. Through the scope, she saw a shift in the darkness. A face pressed tightly against a rifle stock. He was scanning the third-floor windows of her building. He was looking at the main window, where she had made the first 11 kills. He didn't know she had moved to the loophole. He paused, his gaze fixing on the empty mattress. He thought he had found her. Quinn saw his shoulder tighten. He was preparing to fire a long, sustained burst into the mattress. She didn't hold her breath. She didn't have the strength left to hold it. She just let the air leak slowly from her cracked lips. The crosshairs settled squarely between the dark shapes of his eyes. She pulled the trigger. Crack. The window frame across the valley exploded. The dark silhouette jerked violently backward, vanishing into the pitch black of the clinic room. His rifle clattered out of the window, falling 2 stories and bouncing off the hard-packed dirt below. 14. Quinn kept the rifle mounted. She waited 1 minute, then 2. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Slowly, agonizingly, she let go of the pistol grip. Her fingers were locked into claws, stiff with cramp and dried blood. She let her forehead rest against the cold steel of the receiver. She didn't feel a rush of victory. There was no triumphant surge of music in her head. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness. The coppery taste in her mouth was overwhelming now. The room smelled of sweat, blood, and burnt powder. She reached down with a numb hand and picked up the local radio. She pressed the button, leaving it open. The static hissed into the quiet valley. She listened for an answer. She listened for a threat. There was only silence. From far away, over the southern ridgeline, a new sound began to build. A low, heavy thrumming. The rhythmic chopping of rotor blades beating against the thin mountain air. Dust off. The extraction birds. They were finally here. Quinn closed her eyes. A single tear cut a clean track through the blood and dust on her cheek. She pressed the radio button one last time. "Clear," she whispered into the mic, before letting the radio fall from her hand. Did this gritty, deeply human look at the reality of combat keep you on the edge of your seat? The battlefield is messy, raw, and requires unimaginable sacrifice. If you want more intense, character-driven military storytelling that avoids the Hollywood cliches and dives straight into the harsh reality of survival, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more weekly frontline narratives. Let us know your thoughts below.